No one wanted the beaten and broken $2 Apache girl until a lone cowboy stepped forward and claimed her as family. The Arizona sun hung low burning gold through the late afternoon haze. Its sharp light sliced across the dusty yard of the trading post where wagons stood hitched and the air reeked of horses' sweat and spilled whiskey. A circle of rough-looking men loitered there, not for trade, but for spectacle. At the center of the yard, Jeb Rollins, half-drunk on rot-gut whiskey, dragged a young Apache woman forward by a rope cruelly knotted around her wrists. His boots tore shallow furrows in the dirt as he yanked her like a piece of property. His shirt clung with grime and sweat, his laughter sharp and ugly. $2. That's all she's worth, he barked. $2 damn for anyone who wants her, strong enough to cook hall water or whatever else a man might need. Laughter rippled through the crowd. The girl stumbled when he shoved her down, hitting the ground hard. Her thin dress slipped from one shoulder as she caught herself on raw-bound hands. She stayed on her knees, breath-ragged long black hair hiding the bruises and cuts marring her face. The fabric of her dress hung in tatters ripped along the side and neckline, revealing skin mottled with bruises, blue-yellow, and dark purple. She kept her eyes fixed on the dirt, not from shame, but survival. Eye contact would only feed their cruelty. Some men spat tobacco juice at her feet. Others chuckled and turned away. One muttered, "Ain't worth the feed," and walked off toward the saloon. Another shook his head. "Trouble's written all over her," Jeb Rollins cursed, jerking the rope again. $2. She's young, she's strong. What's wrong with you cowards? For the woman, every word hit like another lash. Her throat tightened, but she swallowed her fear. Running meant a bullet. Speaking meant a beating. She just had to breathe. Keep breathing. Keep standing. At the edge of the yard stood Clay Mercer, 34 years old, broad-shouldered, his dark hair tucked under a sweat-stained hat. Trail dust covered his coat, and a scar carved from cheekbone to jaw whispered of his years as a Union scout during the war. He'd only come for supplies, flour, coffee shoes for his horse. But something about the scene stopped him cold. The laughter, the cruelty too familiar, too much like the battlefields he'd left behind. Clay wasn't a man who rushed decisions. He measured moments the way a horseman reads the weather before a long ride, careful, deliberate. But watching the girl tremble as she struggled to stay upright stirred something deep in him, something he couldn't reason away. He could almost hear echoes from his past men begging for mercy orders, barked without compassion. His jaw set. This wasn't a fight he'd walk away from. His hand brushed the coins in his pocket, $2 silver. They were meant for nails and lamp oil, but this wasn't a trade. It was about ending something before it scarred her forever. He stepped forward, boots grinding in the dust. The crowd quieted. Jeb Rollins grinned, thinking he'd found a buyer. Clay stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling over both man and woman. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and dropped $2 silver into Jeb's filthy palm. The coins hit with a heavy clink that silenced even the drunkest whispers. Jeb blinked, surprised, then smirked. Now that's more like it. Clay said nothing. His hand slid to his belt, drawing his knife. The girl flinched, her heart hammering. For a moment she thought this stranger was just another man who'd paid to own her. But Clay lowered the blade and cut through the rope at her wrists with one clean motion. The rope fell away, leaving red welts across her skin. She lifted her head just enough to see him slide the knife back into its sheath. No touch, no command, no claim. Just a quiet act that left her free. Jeb Rollins muttered something about getting rid of trouble and staggered off toward the saloon, already forgetting the woman he'd sold like livestock. The men drifted away too, one by one, leaving only dust silence and the faint sound of the wind sweeping through the yard. Clay stood still, his hat shadowing his eyes, watching her sway on her feet, broken, but still standing. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask her story. He just knew one thing leaving her there would have been something he could never live with. Clay Mercer looked at the woman for the first time. Her lips cracked, her breath shallow, her body swaying like one more step might send her crashing to the ground. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask her past. Instead, he placed a steady hand on her elbow and gently guided her toward his mule. Her mind spun, struggling to understand what had just happened. She wanted to pull away to run, but her body was spent, bruised, trembling, empty of strength. A part of her whispered that this was just another man, another chain waiting to close around her wrists. But something in his silence told her otherwise. His grip was firm yet kind, guiding, not forcing. It had been years since she'd felt a touch that didn't hurt. Clay lifted her carefully onto the mule's back, his movements slow, cautious not to jar her ribs. After tying down the saddlebags, he took the reins and began walking north toward the winding trail that led into the hills. Neither spoke. The silence between them was heavy but not cruel. Two souls carrying too many ghosts to share with a stranger. As the trading post shrank behind them, the woman gripped the saddle horn and reminded herself to breathe. For the first time in a long while, Naya Redfeather wasn't waiting for a blow. She wasn't waiting to be sold again. And Clay Mercer, the quiet cowboy with no family and too many memories, promised himself he wouldn't turn back. Not because it was easy, but because leaving her there would have been a weight he could never carry. The sun slipped behind the ridge's shadows, stretching long across the trail. Two figures, one broken, one scarred, moved steadily through the fading light toward a cabin that neither yet knew would change them both. The mule carried them along the dry wash until the air cooled the desert, filling with the sharp scent of sage and creosote. The path narrowed to a dusty trail between scattered cottonwoods. Naya swayed in the saddle, every step of the mule sending a dull ache through her body. She wanted to ask where he was taking her, who he was, and why he'd done what no other man had the decency to do, but her throat stayed dry. Instead, she watched the set of his shoulders broad, steady, his hand firm on the reins as he walked beside her in silence. Clay Mercer hadn't meant to leave town with anything more than flour and coffee. Yet here he was, leading a mule that carried a wounded woman instead of supplies. That same heavy feeling pressed on him, the one he used to know on the battlefields years ago when men's lives were traded by the orders of those who never bled. He'd promised himself after the war to keep to his own company, no people, no pain. But when he'd seen her standing there bound and humiliated, he knew he wouldn't sleep again if he turned his back. That was reason enough. After an hour's climb, the cabin came into view, a small pine log shack set against a low ridge where the cottonwoods whispered in the wind. Smoke curled weakly from the stovepipe, and a small corral held two thin cows. Beyond it lay the faint outline of a field where beans and corn once grew. It wasn't much, but it was his. For the first time, Clay wondered what it might look like through another's eyes. He helped Naya down carefully. She winced when his hands brushed her ribs, but he stepped back quickly, giving her space. She stood unsteady in the yard, dress torn dust clinging to her skin. Her eyes darted from the cabin door to him, unsure if this was freedom or just another kind of prison. "Inside," he said quietly. Not as an order, but an invitation. Then he opened the door and stepped aside. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and old coffee. A narrow bed sat against the far wall with a folded blanket at its foot. A rough-hewn table stood beside the stove, 2 chairs beside it, one worn smooth from years of use. His rifle leaned in the corner, boots and gear lined neatly along the wall. It wasn't a home meant for company, and he knew it. He felt the bare silence of it now, as if it might make her uneasy. Naya hesitated in the doorway, shoulders tense, eyes scanning the room, as if deciding whether it was safer inside or out there with the coyotes. She remembered the men in town, their hands, their laughter, and though fear pressed against her ribs, she stepped in. At least there were walls here, and no crowd. Clay set the flour and coffee on the table, then pulled a small bar of soap and a folded cotton shirt from a chest. He placed them on the bed without a word. Naya looked from the items to him, wary. For a long moment she thought it might be a trick that he meant for her to wash, then offer herself in return. Her heart pounded against her bruised chest, her fists tightening. But Clay simply turned away, crouched by the stove, and began stoking the fire. He set a pot of water to boil his back to her, not watching, not asking. She waited for the demand that never came. Slowly her breath steadied. She lifted the soap with trembling fingers, touched the coarse shirt, worn but clean. It was all he had to give, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Clay Mercer sank into the chair beside the stove, tipping his hat low to shade his eyes. "You can wash," he said, voice rough but steady. "I'll stay put." He didn't look her way, and Naya Redfeather understood what that meant: privacy, choice, dignity. 3 things the world had stolen from her long ago. She washed in silence, the warm water stinging as it ran over her split lip and the cuts along her arms. Dirt and dried blood lifted away, leaving her skin raw but clean. When she slipped into the cotton shirt he'd given her, it hung loose and long, falling below her knees, covering the torn dress she folded and set aside like the last remnant of another life. For the first time in months, maybe longer, she didn't feel eyes crawling over her. Clay listened to the faint splash of water and the scrape of cloth, his thoughts circling. He hadn't planned for any of this, not beyond cutting her loose in that trading post yard. He didn't know who she was, why she'd been tied, or what hell she'd come from. But pressing questions now would only shatter the fragile quiet between them. She would speak when she chose. When she finished, Naya moved to the bed and sat on the edge, her legs trembling from exhaustion. She looked at him, then finally lifting her eyes to his face. He wasn't watching her. His gaze was fixed on the stove's small flame, his scar catching the firelight, his jaw set firm. She realized he looked just as worn and tired as she felt, though his pain came from a different kind of battle. For a heartbeat, she wanted to ask why. Why he'd spent his money. Why he'd bothered to cut her free when every other man had turned away. The words hovered on her tongue, but she swallowed them. Silence for now was safer. Clay leaned back, arms crossed loosely. "Get some rest," he said quietly. "You'll need it." Naya eased down onto the bed, pulling the blanket over herself. The shirt smelled faintly of soap and wood smoke. She turned toward the wall, gripping the blanket tight, waiting for footsteps. A shadow, a hand reaching for her. None came. She only heard the soft creak of his chair, the faint sigh of his boots near the stove. He wasn't moving closer. He was standing guard. Her pulse slowed. Her breathing steadied. In the hush of that small cabin with firelight flickering against the logs, and no voices jeering in the dark, Naya felt something she had nearly forgotten: safety. Fragile, but real. She closed her eyes and finally drifted into sleep, while Clay Mercer sat with his hat tilted low, half awake, half watching, guarding the quiet, until night deepened into dawn. Morning light crept through the cracks of the shutters, striping the cabin floor in pale gold. The stove had burned down to glowing coals, and the air was cool enough that Clay's breath showed faintly as he exhaled. He'd slept only in brief snatches through the night boots planted firm on the floor, habits he hadn't shaken since the war. When he finally stirred upright, the sound woke Naya. She blinked, disoriented, clutching the blanket tighter around her shoulders. For a split second, panic flared in her chest. But then she saw the cabin walls, the bed beneath her, and Clay at the stove. Her breath eased. The same question that haunted her dreams rose again. Was this man different, or just waiting for his moment? Clay poured water into the kettle, set it on the stove. He could feel her eyes on him, but didn't turn. He wanted to give her space, let her settle, before words crowded in too soon. "Coffee'll be ready soon," he said over his shoulder. "There's bread and beans, too." His tone was calm, even not coaxing, not demanding, just the plain voice of a man who'd lived too long with silence. Naya sat up slowly, her ribs aching beneath the fabric. She pulled the shirt close, remembering the shredded dress folded near the bed. Questions pressed inside her chest. Why had he bought her? What did he want? Every man she'd ever known had wanted something. His quiet unsettled her more than cruelty ever had. She watched as Clay sliced bread from a tin, laid it on a plate, and motioned for her to sit. Hesitant, she crossed the room and lowered herself into the chair opposite him. Her hands trembled as she reached for the bread, not from hunger alone, but from the tension of waiting for him to speak, to claim, to demand. Instead, Clay ate in silence, his movements steady and unhurried. The quiet between them stretched, but it wasn't sharp anymore. It almost felt steady human. After a moment, he glanced toward the torn bundle of cloth near the bed. "You'll need something that fits," he said simply. "That one's no good anymore. I'll ride into town later this week." He didn't ask her size, didn't press for thanks. It was just a practical statement. Naya studied him across the table. The man who had bought her for $2 silver, yet gave her food space and choice. Her heart wavered between suspicion and a cautious, fragile spark of trust. Naya Redfeather tested him with a question so soft it almost broke the quiet. Her voice was hoarse, rough from disuse. "Why did you pay?" Clay Mercer paused, lowering his coffee cup. For the first time, his eyes met hers, steady, calm, but not cold. "Because leaving you there would have been wrong," he said. $2 didn't matter. You did. He didn't dress it up or reach for kind words. It was simple truth, plain as dirt and twice as solid. For a long moment she held his gaze, searching for a lie, and finding none. The answer was too direct to be anything but real. Something inside her shifted. She understood he wasn't going to explain further. He wasn't a man who wasted words. Later that afternoon, Clay carried in a load of firewood. When he set it by the wall, he saw Naya move quietly to the small chest where his trail coat lay folded. Without asking, she took a needle and thread from the shelf and began to mend a tear in the lining. He stopped for a heartbeat, watching her. It was the first time she'd acted on her own since coming to his cabin. He didn't say a thing, but deep down, something eased inside him. Maybe she was starting to see this place as more than just a stop between one hardship and the next. That evening, the fire burned warm, throwing soft shadows across the log walls. Naya sat at the table, the mended coat folded neatly beside her hands, resting in her lap. Across from her, Clay ran a whetstone along his knife in slow, rhythmic strokes. The sound filled the quiet like a heartbeat. She thought about what he'd said earlier, how $2 didn't matter. She thought about the way he kept his distance, how he never touched her without reason. Something told her he deserved more than her silence. Her chest tightened. Speaking her name had always been dangerous. Names could be used, turned against you, branded to your pain. But here in the flickering firelight, she felt the weight of holding it in was heavier than the risk of letting it out. "My name," she started, her voice catching, "is Naya." Clay looked up from his knife. "Naya," he repeated, firm and even, like he was engraving it into stone. He gave a single nod, then went back to his sharpening. He didn't ask where she came from or what she'd endured. He just acknowledged it as if her name alone was enough. For the first time in as long as she could remember, Naya Redfeather felt seen not as property, not as burden, but as a person. That thought followed her as she pulled the blanket over herself later that night. She lay awake for a while, listening to the stove tick as it cooled, hearing the faint creak of his chair as he shifted near the fire. The fear that had gripped her since the trading post began to fade, replaced by something she barely recognized, not safety, yet not trust, but the beginning of both. By the end of the week, the flour sack was nearly empty, the coffee tin down to its last spoonful, and the salt barrel scraped clean. Clay had known since the first morning that a trip into town was coming, but he'd waited, letting Naya rest and gather strength. Supplies weren't a choice, they were survival. That night, in his usual even tone, he said, "We'll ride to town tomorrow. Need flour, coffee. Maybe boots." It wasn't a question or an order, just a fact. The words tightened her chest. The image of that trading yard still burned in her mind, the rope, the laughter, the spitting dirt. She'd wondered if the town would remember, if faces would sneer, if someone might try to drag her back. But she nodded anyway. Food didn't grow on fear. She told herself she would walk beside him, not behind. The next morning, Clay saddled his horse and her mule, checked every strap twice, and tied the empty flour sack across the saddle horn. From an old chest, he pulled a plain wool shawl and handed it to her. "Wear this," he said. "Wind'll bite." She wrapped it tight, hiding the thin cotton shirt he'd given her days ago. The torn dress, what was left of her past, had been cut into rags and burned. The trail to town stretched long and quiet, giving her too much time to think. She wondered as much about Clay as she did about herself. Why had a man who lived alone in a cabin cared enough to interfere? Did he expect something she didn't yet understand? He had never touched her, except to help her down from the mule. He hadn't asked about her past, hadn't demanded her body. That alone set him apart from every man she'd known since her capture. She didn't trust easily, but she couldn't deny that with each day spent under his roof, her fear loosened its grip, one thread at a time. By mid-morning, the town came into view, smoke curling from chimneys, sunlight glinting off glass windows, the rattle of wagons, and the distant shouts of men filling the air. Naya's stomach twisted. She pulled the shawl tighter, her fingers white around its edge. Clay noticed, but said nothing. He simply kept his horse close beside her mule, his hand resting easy on the reins, his presence steady as stone, close enough so everyone watching would know she wasn't alone. They tied up their horses at the hitch rail outside Clyde Dobbins's general store. Heads turned right away. A ranch hand leaning against the post narrowed his eyes, whispering something sharp to the man beside him. Two women on the boardwalk paused mid-step. Daisy Vance clutched her basket tighter, while Ruth Ann Miller tugged at her sleeve, urging her to move along. Naya Redfeather felt their stares press into her skin like stones. Every look reminded her she didn't belong. Part of her wanted to turn around and disappear back into the desert. Clay Mercer stepped down first, then turned and offered her his hand. She hesitated, the memory of that trading yard flashing through her mind, but when she looked into his eyes, she saw no pity, no scorn, just quiet steadiness. She placed her hand in his, letting him help her down. Standing beside him, she straightened her shoulders. If they were going to look, let them see her as someone who stood beside a man, not beneath him. Inside the store smelled of leather flour and lamp oil. Shelves were crowded with bolts of fabric, jars of nails, and tins of beans. Clyde Dobbins, the storekeeper, looked up from his ledger and froze a little too long before clearing his throat. "Need flour, coffee, salt?" Clay said flatly. "And a bolt of cloth blue if you've got it." Clyde blinked, nodded quickly, and began filling the order. Naya stood close, her hands clasped before her. She hadn't been inside a store since before the raid, the one that had taken her from her people. Everything here felt almost unreal. The order, the quiet, the smell of clean wood and dust. When Clay added boots. Women's size 6. Her breath caught. He had noticed her feet days ago, barefoot and sore on his cabin floor, though he'd said nothing. The thought of him remembering that small detail unsettled her in ways she didn't expect. The door swung open, and with it came the stench of whiskey. Jeb Rollins stepped in, the same ranch hand who'd once held her rope. His smirk twisted when his eyes found her, then slid to Clay. "Well, I'll be damned," he sneered. "Thought I got rid of that problem. Didn't take you for the kind to waste good coin on trash." Naya's stomach knotted, her breath catching in her throat. The phantom bite of coarse rope seemed to tighten around her wrists again. Clay stepped forward, not quick but firm. He planted himself between her and Jeb, his shadow long across the floorboards. "You took your money," he said quietly. "That was the end of it. Leave it there." Jeb spat on the floor. "She'll bring you nothing but trouble." Clay's jaw didn't move, his eyes steady. "Then she'll be my trouble." The silence was thick enough to cut. Clyde Dobbins cleared his throat loudly, setting the sack of flour and tin of coffee on the counter. The noise broke the tension. Jeb muttered something under his breath and stomped back outside. Naya exhaled shakily, realizing she'd been holding her breath. Her hands trembled under her shawl. Clay paid, gathered the supplies, and nodded toward the door. Outside, eyes still followed them, but no one spoke. He loaded the goods onto the mule, then helped her into the saddle. Before she could adjust her shawl, he leaned close enough for only her to hear. "You're safe with me. Let 'em look all they want, they can't take you." Her throat tightened as she nodded. The words didn't erase her fear, but they steadied her heartbeat. For the first time since that yard, she believed she might not have to face those stairs alone again. They rode out of town slowly, dust curling up behind them as the distance swallowed the noise. Naya sat taller in the saddle, now her grip looser on the horn. Clay rode beside her, quiet and unshakable. Now she understood why people listened when he spoke. He didn't use many words, but when he did, he meant them. Back at the cabin, the sun dipped behind the ridge, painting the sky in firelight. Naya carried the bolt of blue cloth to the table, running her fingers over its smooth surface. It was hers, bought not with shame, but with care. She traced the edge, feeling a small seed of belonging take root inside her. For the first time, she began to think that maybe this place wasn't just his home. It could be hers too. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm. The shelves were full again, and the bolt of blue cloth waited neatly folded until Naya cut it into pieces. Her hands moved with practiced skill, her stitches small and sure. Soon a dress began to take shape. Clay noticed the way she carried herself when she tried it on, the way her shoulders straightened, her chin lifted. She'd burned the old torn dress herself, the flames in the fire pit devouring that part of her past. The smoke rose like a farewell to pain that wouldn't return. If anyone in town wondered who she was, where she'd come from, or what she'd endured, neither Clay nor Naya offered answers. The silence protected them both. Days passed in a quiet pattern that needed no words, Clay splitting wood, hauling water, his axe ringing steady in the air. Naya tending the stove, stirring beans, feeding the fire. In the evenings he worked leather straps at the table, while she sewed by the firelight, her hands patient and calm. Sometimes she hummed low songs from her people, soft and mournful, carrying memories of what she'd lost. And though Clay Mercer never said a word, he'd pause his work for a moment, letting her voice fill the cabin like a prayer neither of them dared to speak aloud. Clay Mercer never asked her about the songs she hummed in the evenings, but he listened, and somehow the sound made the cabin feel less hollow. Folks in town, though, still wondered. They'd seen them ride out together after that morning at the store, and whispers carried quick across the saloon. Was she there by choice? Or was it just another kind of captivity? Truth was, Naya Redfeather had wondered the same thing in the quiet hours before dawn. But with each sunrise, the answer grew clearer. When she laid out food without being told, when she weeded the small patch of earth behind the corral, when she folded Clay's mended coat and placed it by his chair, she began to understand she stayed because she chose to. The cabin gave her something she hadn't had since before the raid's control over her own steps. Clay noticed the shift, too. He wasn't a man prone to tender thoughts, but even he could feel the air change. She no longer waited for instructions, no longer flinched when he moved near. When he draped a blanket across her shoulders at night, she didn't tense, she simply adjusted it and breathed easy again. Trust had crept in slowly, built not on words, but on quiet presence. Still, questions lingered, the kind no one dared to voice aloud. Where's her family? Does she still have people out there? Would someone come looking? Naya thought of it often, but never said it aloud. She'd been taken from her camp 3 months earlier, when raiders drove her people into the hills and scattered them. Whether they'd survived, she didn't know. And if they had, they wouldn't be looking for her in a white man's town. The ache of not knowing stayed sharp, but the rhythm of each day dulled it enough to breathe. Clay never pushed her to speak. He carried his own ghost's men lost in war, a brother buried in Missouri land turned to ash under cavalry fire. He knew silence could be kinder than curiosity. The storm hit without warning near the week's end, rolling hard off the horizon, wind howling through the pines. Rain came down in sheets, rattling the roof like rifle fire. Together they fought it back, hammering canvas across the seams, driving nails through wet shingles while water streamed down their faces. Naya's hair stuck to her cheeks, her palms raw from gripping the hammer, but she didn't stop. She stayed beside him until the last nail held. When they ducked inside, soaked through and breathless, Clay stoked the fire high, while Naya stripped off her drenched shawl, hanging it over the chair. For a moment, they simply stood there, steam rising from their clothes, firelight reflecting in tired eyes. No words passed, just an understanding they'd faced the storm together, and the cabin still stood. That night they ate in silence while rain drummed steady on the roof. Steam curled from their mugs of coffee. Then Clay reached across the table, his rough hand finding hers. He didn't hold on long, just enough for her to turn her palm and let their fingers rest together, steady, unforced. No one outside would ever know, but in that small room, the gesture meant more than words. Naya thought of the $2 silver, the price of her freedom, and how he'd never spoken of it again. He hadn't reminded her, hadn't claimed her debt. He'd given her space to rebuild herself, and that simple mercy warmed her more than the fire ever could. When the rain eased, the night fell quiet. The stove ticked as it cooled, and Clay leaned back in his chair, eyes heavy with fatigue. Naya folded the blue cloth on the table for the next day's sewing. The cabin no longer felt like a shelter for two strangers. It was becoming a home. Morning broke bright and clean. The ground shimmered with puddles, the air rich with the scent of wet pine and soil. Naya rose early, her hair still heavy with damp, and set beans to boil, while Clay went to check the corral. When he came back, his boots muddy, she noticed the limp in his step, worse than usual, his jaw tight as he pulled off his hat. She hesitated, then finally asked, "Your leg, was it from the war?" Clay froze for a beat, then set his hat on the table, eyes fixed on the stove fire. "Bullet at Shiloh," he said. "Never healed right. Weather makes it worse." His tone was plain, but the weight behind it said enough. Naya nodded once. The answer explained what others might have wondered. Why a man like him lived alone, far from town. His limp had slowed his body. His ghosts had slowed his heart. Days found their rhythm again, but nights were different now. Naya slept lighter, her mind still haunted by old terrors, the yard, the rope, the jeers. She'd wake in the dark chest, tight, clutching the blanket until her hands ached. Clay always heard. He never said much, just shifted in his chair and spoke softly from the shadows. "You're all right. You're safe here." The words weren't tender, but they were steady, a truth she could hold on to. One night she woke with a cry caught in her throat. Sweat on her skin, the fire burned low to embers. Clay rose quietly, his boots brushing the floorboards. He didn't rush to her side or reach for her. He just stepped close and stopped at the edge of the bed, waiting. Naya Redfeather's chest rose and fell fast, her hands trembling as she clutched the blanket tight around her shoulders. For a long moment she said nothing. Then slowly she reached out and placed her hand over Clay Mercer's. Her voice came soft and unsteady. "Stay." He sat down at the edge of the bed, his weight barely sinking into the mattress, keeping the blanket between them. He didn't move closer, didn't reach for her. She focused on her breathing, matching it to his until the shaking in her fingers began to ease. The room filled with silence, the kind that had weight to it. Outside, the wind brushed against the cabin walls, and inside only the steady rhythm of their breaths remained. Her fear didn't vanish, but it found a place to rest. Clay finally spoke, his voice low and sure. "I won't hurt you." "I know," she whispered, her throat tightening. It wasn't just belief, it was choice. She chose to say it. As the night deepened, Naya turned toward him, her forehead brushing his shoulder. Clay lowered his head, pressing his lips softly to her hair. The gesture was uncertain, almost hesitant, but it was real. It wasn't born of pity or need. It was something honest. Her cheek brushed his jaw, and their lips met in a slow, trembling kiss. It wasn't graceful or practiced. It was careful, fragile, but theirs alone. And for anyone who might have wondered, no, this wasn't a trade, nor a debt being paid. There was no rope, no demand, no coin between them. Just a woman choosing to lean closer, and a man steady enough to let her move at her own pace. They lay back without breaking that thin line of trust. Clay eased onto the bed beside her, leaving space, his arm resting lightly across her waist. She placed her hand over his, holding it there. Their breathing found a rhythm, her eyes closing, not from exhaustion, but from peace. For the first time in months, Naya Redfeather slept beside someone and did not fear what morning would bring. Clay Mercer lay awake longer, his mind tracing old scars and new truths. He hadn't wanted company. His life had been small, just a cabin, a corral, and ghosts that never left him alone. Yet here she was, and somehow the silence wasn't the same with her in it. He stared at the soft glow of the dying fire and finally admitted what he hadn't said out loud. He wanted her there. Not from pity, not from duty, but because her presence made the quiet feel alive again. When sleep finally took him too, the cabin held no echoes of fear, only the calm of something neither of them had dared imagine before. The days that followed carried a new rhythm. Naya moved through the cabin with purpose, now folding laundry by the stove, setting food, before Clay could ask, humming as she worked. Clay noticed the change, but said nothing. He let her find her place in her own way, the same way he once learned to read a trail, patiently, step by step. If anyone had been watching, they might have wondered, was she truly free to stay, or simply trapped by new walls? The answer showed in the way she carried herself. She could have left if she wanted. The desert was harsh, but not impossible. Yet night after night, she chose to stay. And Clay never spoke of the $2 silver again. For him, that matter had ended the moment the rope hit the dirt. Spring brought new work fences to mend the corral to check, and a patch of earth to clear for planting. Naya worked beside him, her palms rough from pulling weeds, but her back straight. Sometimes she caught herself watching him, how his broad shoulders moved beneath his shirt, how the limp slowed him, but never stopped him. He noticed once, caught her gaze, and for the first time since she'd met him, he smiled, small, fleeting, but enough to stop her breath. Late one afternoon, with the sun sinking behind the ridge, 2 riders appeared on the rise beyond the wash. Clay spotted them first, dust trailing behind their horses. His jaw tightened, though he said nothing until they drew close enough for Naya to hear the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather. One of the riders was Jeb Rollins, red-faced and bloated from drink, the same man who'd once dragged her across the yard by a rope. The other wore a tarnished badge on his vest, its shine long dulled by bar smoke and neglect. Naya's throat closed. The memory of the rope burned through her wrists again. The bucket she carried slipped from her hands, clattering across the hard dirt. Without a word, Clay stepped in front of her, his stance steady. One hand resting near his belt, but not yet on the Colt holstered there. He didn't need to draw. His stillness spoke for him. Jeb Rollins spat in the dust. "You owe me, Mercer. That woman wasn't yours to take. I want her back, or I want my money doubled." The deputy shifted uneasily in the saddle. "There've been complaints," he said, voice uncertain. "Talk of stolen cattle, and of a woman being held against her will. I need to hear her say she's here by choice." Naya's chest heaved. Fear clawed at her throat, freezing her tongue. The sound of the trading yard came rushing back, the jeers, the spit, the sting of rope. But then she looked at Clay's back, broad, unmoving, steady as a stone wall, and she found her voice. "I stay because I choose to, Naya," Red Feather said. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled against her skirt. Marshal Silas Boone studied her for a long moment, his gaze sharp beneath the brim of his hat. He was searching for doubt, but her eyes met his, firm and unflinching now. At last he gave a small nod and turned toward Jeb Rollins. "You took his money fair. That's the end of it. If you've got a complaint, file it with Judge Horace Greeley if you can still spell your damn name." Jeb's face twisted with fury. He spat into the dirt, yanked his horse's reins hard, and wheeled away, muttering curses that disappeared into the wind. Marshal Boone tipped his hat toward Clay and Naya. "Look after each other," he said, then rode off slow, his badge catching the sunlight as he vanished down the trail. When the dust settled, Naya realized she was still gripping her skirts tight in both fists. She released them and exhaled a shaking breath she hadn't known she was holding. Clay Mercer turned toward her, meeting her eyes. This time he spoke more than his usual few words. "No one takes you from here. Not while I'm still standing." Her throat tightened not with fear, but with something steadier, something she hadn't dared name. She stepped closer and rested her forehead against his chest, her breath trembling against him. Clay didn't move to hold her. He didn't crowd her. He simply stood, solid and still, letting her lean until she found her strength again. That night the fire glowed low in the hearth. Coyotes cried somewhere out on the plain, their howls thin against the wind. Naya sat at the table watching Clay run his whetstone over his knife in slow, deliberate strokes. She had expected men to come. She had feared it every day. But now that it had happened and passed, she knew the truth. Clay Mercer would never let anyone chain her again. And she herself would never again stand silent before men who tried. The fear hadn't vanished. It had simply changed shape. It was no longer the fear of being alone. It was the fear of losing what she'd found something worth fighting for. The days that followed carried a new weight. Clay moved with quiet vigilance, and every time he stepped out to the corral with his rifle resting easy in his hand, Naya found herself glancing toward the ridge, half expecting riders to return. But none did, and the silence that lingered afterward felt like fragile peace. Still the same question hung in the air for anyone who might hear their story. What bound her to him now? Was it safety, gratitude, or choice? That answer began to take shape one morning when Clay spoke as she poured coffee. "We're riding to the county seat," he said simply. "Gonna get it down on paper so no one can twist it later." His tone was flat, as always, but Naya heard what lay beneath. The paper wasn't for him. It was for her. A shield against lies and men like Jeb Rollins who might come again. She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll go." The ride was long, 2 hours of sundust and open trail. The wind tugged at her shawl, but she sat straight in the saddle. Beside her, Clay's limp showed in the rhythm of his stride, but his pace never faltered. She thought of the day he'd cut her free, the sound of the rope snapping the disbelief in her chest. He hadn't owed her anything, and yet he'd chosen to carry her burdens as his own. Now he was leading her toward a different kind of freedom, one written in ink, not in blood. The county seat was louder than the small town they'd visited before, wagons crowding the main street, traders shouting over bales of hay, women hurrying with baskets, children darting between horses' legs. Naya's stomach knotted like it had that first trip into town, but this time something had changed. The blue dress she'd sewn from the cloth Clay had bought fit her shoulders perfectly. The boots he'd chosen steadied her steps. She walked beside him now, not behind. And though eyes followed her, she met them without lowering her gaze. Inside the courthouse, the air smelled of ink and old wood. The clerk behind the desk looked over his spectacles, but asked no questions. Clay spoke plainly, as he always did. "The woman beside me lives with me by choice. I want it written down clear." The clerk dipped his pen and scratched out the words on parchment. He slid it across the desk. Clay signed first his name, bold, sure, and practiced. Naya hesitated, her fingers brushing the quill. Her hand trembled, but she wrote each letter of her name with care. Letters she hadn't written in years, but still remembered. When she set the pen down, something inside her eased. The question was settled for anyone who might have wondered. She had spoken it before a lawman, and now she had written it before the county. Naya Redfeather was free by her own word and her own hand. Afterward, Clay took her to a quiet general store down the street. He bought flour beans and coffee, then paused at the counter. "Got rings?" he asked. The storekeeper Clyde Dobbins raised a brow, then opened a small wooden box. Inside lay a few plain bands of brass and silver. Clay picked one without hesitation and paid with coins he might have used for tools or nails. Naya stood beside him, heart thudding, unsure what to say. That evening, when they sat down to supper, Clay Mercer set the ring on the table between them. He didn't kneel, didn't soften his voice. He just said it the way a man like him always did, plain, certain, and from the heart. "Stay with me for good," Clay Mercer said quietly, setting the small brass ring on the table between them. "As my wife, if you want it." Naya Redfeather stared at the ring, her breath unsteady. Her mind flashed back to the trading yard, the rope biting her wrists, the laughter that had cut through her like a knife. Then she looked at Clay, the man who had never once treated her as something to own. The man who had placed a pen in her hand and let her name stand beside his. Her voice came firm, though her hands still trembled. "Yes, but as your equal." A ghost of a smile crossed his lips. "As my equal." He slipped the ring onto her finger, his calloused hands careful, as if handling something fragile. The cool metal warmed against her skin, not a shackle, but a choice. The fire burned low, its glow flickering across the cabin walls. Their eyes met across the table, and the silence between them held no fear this time, only understanding. Naya reached across, resting her hand atop his. When Clay stood, she rose with him. Their first kiss by the fire had been cautious, uncertain. This one was steady, slow, deliberate, sure. Later they lay beneath the blankets, the warmth of the stove fading as night settled in. His hand rested lightly against her back, her breath soft against his chest. What passed between them wasn't rushed or demanded, it was tender, patient, real. There were no more questions about whether she was his by trade or by will. She was his because she chose to be, and he was hers because he'd opened his heart to her. When sleep came, it brought no fear, no uncertainty. Only quiet certainty. They had built something lasting inside those walls. Spring arrived gently, bringing meltwater through the wash and green life pushing through the soil. The cabin no longer looked like a lonely outpost against the ridge. It looked lived in clothes on the line, laughter by the table, coffee brewing on the stove. Naya woke with the sun tying her hair back as she stepped barefoot into the small garden behind the corral. Rows of beans and squash marked her careful work, the soil turned by her own hands. From the porch, Clay watched her, the scar on his cheek catching the light. For the first time in years, he realized he wasn't a man alone anymore. This life was theirs. The question folks had whispered ever since the day he spent $2 silver. Was she bound to him by debt or by choice had already been answered. Her name was written beside his in the county clerk's book. The ring on her finger gleamed faintly in the firelight. Every step she took around that cabin spoke of freedom, not chains. Still, the town had its talk. Whispers trailed behind them when they walked the boardwalk together, men muttering that he'd bought her, women shaking their heads in judgment. Clay ignored it, and Naya, after weeks of holding her shoulders tight, finally learned to meet their stares without flinching. In time, the gossip faded. People grew used to seeing them side by side. One bright morning, they rode back into town not for supplies, but for Reverend Amos Clay. The small church smelled of beeswax and dust. A few curious townsfolk filled the pews. Marshal Silas Boone leaned against the back wall, his hat low, a quiet smile beneath his mustache. The preacher's voice carried steady through the stillness. "Do you take her freely to be your wife?" "I do," Clay said, his tone firm, certain. The preacher turned to Naya. "And do you take him?" She lifted her chin, her voice unwavering. "I do." Clay slid the same ring back onto her finger, before God, the law, and the whole town. Her chest tightened not with fear but with relief. No man could ever again claim her as property. She stood as wife-partner equal. Afterward, Clay bought a slice of pie from the cafe, one for her, one for him, and they ate side by side at the counter while the townsfolk pretended not to stare. When they mounted up to leave, Naya glanced back and caught the eye of Daisy Vance, one of the women who'd whispered about her weeks before. This time the woman didn't look away. She gave a small, hesitant nod, as if admitting something had changed. The ride home was long and sun-warmed. At the cabin, Clay carried in the flour and coffee, while Naya spread the new lace he'd bought across the table, smoothing it with careful hands. She turned to him, then her eyes soft but sure. "This is my home now," she said. He met her gaze. Ours. That night they sat on the porch steps, coffee mugs in hand, watching the sun bleed gold across the ridge. The garden rustled behind them. The cattle lowed softly in the corral, and the fire inside painted the windows with warmth. Clay reached for her hand, his rough fingers closing gently around hers. "We're family now," he said quietly. Naya leaned her head against his shoulder, a small smile touching her lips. "We are." The story that had begun in a dusty yard full of jeers and rope ended here in the quiet desert dusk, with two souls who had chosen each other freely. There were no debts left, no chains, no questions of belonging. She was no longer the woman sold for $2. She was Naya Mercer, wife-partner equal. And Clay Mercer, once a man haunted by war and solitude, was finally home. The night settled soft around them, carrying the peace they had both fought to find. Their life, hard-won and quiet, was theirs to keep.